but Matt Sigelman is the president of the Burning Glass Institute and a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. He was named by Forbes to its Future of Work 50. Matt has dedicated his career to unlocking new avenues for mobility, opportunity, and equity through skills. The Burning Glass Institute advances data-driven research and practices on the future of work, the future of learning. Previously, as CEO of KKR-backed Lightcast, Matt and his team invented the field of real-time labor market data and breakthrough innovation that transformed the way employers, education institutions, policymakers, and workers understand, plan for, and connect with the world of work. By mining billions of job openings and career histories, Matt led the company to become the global authority on market for talent. Prior to Lightcast, Matt worked at McKinsey & Company and at Capital One. He writes widely on the job market, he testifies before Congress, and is consulted frequently by public officials and global media. Matt holds an AB from Princeton University and an MBA from Harvard and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. I had the opportunity to listen to him and to talk with him while I was at the conference. He was one of the speakers there. It was extremely impressive. And you know how it is at a conference when speakers are very generous, they say yes to everything. I said, Matt, I need you to come to Upstate. He said, yes, I'm more than happy to do that. And so we followed up immediately and got on the schedule. We were fortunate that even when the time changed, he was able to be a part of it. So please help me welcome Mr. Matt Sigelman. Give me a minute. I was trying to pull this up. Not you, but them. They're my green jacket guys. Okay, yeah, that's where you need to go, Brandon.
That's fine. I got it.
Don't work with the time.
That's a shame.
Good morning. It's great to be with all of you. USC Upstate is a thriving institution that is the dynamo for a thriving region. Now, one of the speakers we just heard from talked about what it takes to maintain growth, and he said that what it takes is talent. What it takes is not just talent, but the right talent with the right sets of skills. We tend to think a lot about AI impacts and about the future as affecting jobs, but jobs, as it turns out, are really about skills. The DNA of jobs is about the skills that it takes somebody to do them. And so what we see changing more than the jobs that people are in, we hear a lot of hyperbolized headlines about how many jobs are going to go away. Not sure that any of that's right. But what I do see in the data that we look at is that the skills that people need in order to continue to work, in order to continue to be productive, in order to rise in their careers, are changing, and they're changing fast. So what I'm looking forward to doing today is to sharing a little bit about what we're learning about those changes, how the workforce is changing, and how we can make sure that the students we graduate are ready for exceptional careers, that the workforce that we build here in the Upstate is the kind of workforce that's got the skills to be globally competitive. Turns out it takes a little bit to be globally competitive to learn how to advance a slide. I'm learning. My wife says I'm a little slow. So let's just talk about when I say that there's a lot of dynamism and skills, what I actually mean about that. I'm going to start off sharing a little bit from a study that we did together with the Boston Consulting Group a year or two back. What we did is we looked at how jobs are changing. And what we all hear about the idea of a half-life of skills, the idea that skills are decaying. And so we said, okay, let's just look at what are the skills that jobs require today, and what are the skills that they required 5 years ago, and how much did it change? You know, we found that the average US job has seen 37% of its skills replaced just in the last 5 years. Now think about, we're used to thinking about big numbers. 37% sounds big, but okay, fair enough. Think about what would happen if 37% of the curriculum of a school changed in 5 years. Well, accreditors would go after you for changing that much of your curriculum. Think about whether 37% of the training that's offered inside our workforce boards, 37% of what's in a L&D catalog inside a corporation has changed. And the answer, of course, is no. By the way, it's easy to sort of think about this as just really being about tech change, but you see on the right, even jobs like marketing assistants, half of their skills are different today from when they were 5 years ago. What do those changes look like? Now, again, like I said, it's easy to think about, hey, look, there's new technologies change, we're used to that. Well, there's certainly some of that going on, but actually what we see is far more profound. In general, what we see is that jobs are mixing skills from across domains. Here's 2 jobs that both handle a lot of data, accountants and data scientists. By the way, a little historical fact for you. Turns out just like data scientists are the hot job of this era, accountants were the data scientists of the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, you didn't need accountants. You just knew how much gold was in your purse, and that's how you ran a firm. It was only when you started having big companies that you needed accountants. I'm comparing them, though, actually not for differences in historical epoch. What are the skills you need to be an accountant? Well, this is what my kids would call the no-duh question, right? You need accounting skills. Okay. What are the skills you need to be a data scientist? Well, before you give me the no-duh answer of data, let me tell you this. When you read millions of job openings and you see what are employers actually looking for, they do look for data skills, but actually they're even more likely to look for programming skills. And they also want data scientists to have extensive business skills, because we don't just pay data scientists to solve problems or to run analytics. We want them to run analytics that solve business problems. Now think about where those different skills live inside an organization, where they live inside schools today. Well, we know that programming skills are with computer science faculty, data skills are with the math faculty, business skills are with the business faculty. And they don't tend to mix all that well. But increasingly, for our graduates to be successful, for our workforce to be prepared, we need to figure out how to cross those lines. By the way, this isn't just the case of professional work. We're seeing the same thing in middle skill work. We're now 8 in 10 so-called middle skill jobs. That's kind of north of high school, south of a 4-year college degree. Where 8 in 10 are now digitally intensive. By the way, they're also the ones that are digitally intensive are growing twice as fast. They are twice as likely to pay a living wage. And where the 2 in 10 that are not are increasingly concentrated in transportation and construction. So increasingly, there's sets of skills that all of our graduates are going to need to have. We'll talk a minute about how that changes in the world of AI. But what this means fundamentally is that as we see new technologies come into bear, they actually are going to challenge us in more ways than we may think. Because what they have a tendency to do is not just to change those individual skills, but to actually change everything else the way the job works. Here's an example of mechanical engineers. I know manufacturing is an important sector here. You'll see on the left, here's the skills that employers tend to ask for when they're looking for mechanical engineers. Now, let's look for mechanical engineers who work in V2I systems or who work on autonomous systems. Now, these are both still mechanical engineers, but you'll see the skills are almost entirely different. It's like a totally different job. And so what you see is that emerging skills aren't just cut and paste. Right? We tend to think about, okay, well, great, students are going to need AI skills. Okay, great, we'll teach an AI course, everything else will be the same. Here's an example just to illustrate of actuaries. Okay, I know you don't tend to think very often about actuaries. I can assure you they do think about you and when you're going to die. let's just sort of talk about them for a second, right? So what do actuaries do? They do computational math. What does machine learning do? Does computational math kind of faster and at greater scale. Interestingly enough, not that many actuaries use machine learning today, but here's the interesting thing. When they do, so what they normally look like, you see on the left, what are the skills you need to be an actuary. But when they do, you see, again, all the other skills change. So what this says is two things. One, we need to rethink in general, not just how do we cut and paste curriculum, but how does this drive us to re-architect our curricula? But it also says, how do we make sure that as fields change, people have a way of coming back? People have a way and a place to come back to acquire the skills that keep them relevant. Let's talk specifically about generative AI and how that could shake things up further. First of all, I want to talk about why AI is not necessarily a force for gloom and doom. I think there's been some discussion of this already. There's certainly a lot of people who are cheerleaders for AI and the potential to make people productive. There's certainly going to be some of that. We also believe that, yes, there are some places where AI replicates human work. And so we have to be able to understand the contours of this. Here's what I mean by understand the contours. I want to talk about two different kinds of automation in past ways of automation, not AI, but automation, that played out very differently. Let's first talk about ATM machines. So ATM stands for automated teller machine, right? So, okay, what should that do? It should automate away the job of tellers. Well, until about 10 years ago, there kept being more and more tellers in America than there were before there were ATMs. That seems a little weird, right? Here's what was going on. When I was coming up, my mom would drag me along to the bank, which sometimes I was willing to do because they gave lollipops. But it was a granite building. There were a whole bunch of teller windows. There were guards and all that kind of stuff. Now there's a branch of the bank at the back of the Piggly Wiggly. It's got, kind of one teller, one assistant manager, and that's it. So the ATM machine actually, it did reduce the number of transactions where you need to see a teller. But because of that, it changed the economics of running a bank branch. It meant they could actually grow. So there's going to be, that's one place. That was one example. Now let's think about airport customer service and the kiosks and now phone apps that have done the same thing. So an airport kiosk and an ATM machine look pretty similar, very similar technology. And think about this. When was the last time you actually talked to someone in an airport other than to say thank you to the person who scanned your boarding pass? Right? So same technology had very different effects. There are many fewer airport customer service workers today per passenger than there were before that technology rolled out. And so we're going to need to be able to map how AI is going to affect different roles in different ways. Some of that effect is not just about the calculus of jobs, but it's about specifically the ways in which it's going to bear out. Let's talk here about, again, two different jobs, marketing specialists and database architects. See, there's some people who are big cheerleaders of AI and who will tell you that AI is going to be a worker's best friend. Why? And they make a good logic for it, a good argument. They'll tell you, okay, well, what's going to happen is that AI is going to make jobs more accessible. Think about all the things that keep people away from good work today. English language proficiency, domain expertise, right? You've got to learn a domain for many years. And all of that could change. So those jobs could suddenly become accessible in ways that they weren't before. But then think about other sets of roles where maybe the opposite might be true. There's a whole bunch of other people who say, hey, this is terrible. There's going to be all the entry-level jobs are going to go away. And how are people going to define their way in? And the reality is, when we've studied this and built models of it, we're finding that both are true. So it's right that there could be some jobs that become more accessible. If you look at London cab drivers, interestingly enough, right? So if you went 10, 20 years ago and tried to get a cab in London, those guys had to take what they called the knowledge. They spent 3 years, typically, on average, memorizing every street, every alleyway in London, and they would, the examiner would say to them, okay, now you're going to Harrowsgate Corner, and how do you get there? And they'd have to know. Now you can buy a GPS, and you're off, right? So that opened up that line of work to a lot of people who wouldn't have had it before. But I want to ask you about a different example. This morning, yesterday morning there was a fine breakfast here, but yesterday morning you were at the breakfast table, and you were looking at the milk carton on the table. There's probably like a whole long paean on the back of it to the beautiful meadow in which the cows were grazing to give you this wonderfully creamy milk. You know what? ChatGPT could have written that just fine. But I bet there was a young marketing assistant who was very proud of that copy. And so what that says is that there are going to be places where, rather than creating new access to job, where the points of access are actually going to go away. Right? It's not that we won't need marketing people. We'll need experienced marketing people to know what kind of drivel to have ChatGPT to write for us. That raises some really important and profound questions about our talent pipelines, about how we prepare graduates. How do you prepare graduates to start their careers in the middle instead of at the beginning? How do we make sure that our workforce has places where has pipelines of talent that are viable if a lot of the roles where right now there's a natural progression of people to develop expertise, a lot of those bottom rungs of the ladder go away. And so those are key things for us to bear in mind. I mentioned before the dynamism of the market is in skills. And that is no less true with AI. Here again, one of these tug of wars that people talk a lot about between automation, will AI replace tasks that people are doing, and augmentation, will it help us do things better? And so we created all these kind of models to try to say, okay, where is it going to do what? And by the way, what we find is that, in fact, it's that there's going to be plenty of places where, in fact, generative AI does help us to do things better. But more broadly, where it does, as a result, change what people need to know how to do. Some tasks go away, other tasks actually become more important. But here's the other interesting thing when that happens. When jobs change, the relationships between them change. Think about that for a second. So what you're seeing here is not like some modern art picture with lots of dots on a page. What you're seeing is how careers travel together. So jobs are actually kind of like pack animals. They run together. And they tend to organize themselves around commonalities and skills. So all the colors that you're seeing on the left, you can see how they're kind of neatly falling into different categories. So one color might be engineering jobs. Another color might be healthcare jobs. You can imagine why they'd stay together. What happens is this. Think about how we progress from job to job today. We progress by building on the skills that we've accrued. We learn a couple of new skills. We move on to another job. Now, if every skill changes inside the career map, it means that the way that I move from job to job changes. I'll give you an example, right? If you look in the machining career path, right, there's a progression from being a machinist to being a CNC machinist to being a CNC programmer. There's also jobs for computer programmers. So the question here is this. You can imagine two different realities, and this is exactly the kind of thing we have to look at. One, where CNC machining becomes more accessible, or rather CNC programming becomes more accessible to CNC machinists as things become, as AI makes things lower code, easier to use. If that were to happen, the job may become further from being a computer programmer, right? Some of the skills that you have to master to become a CNC programmer are very much programming skills. You can imagine the opposite as well, where it might become more and more like a programmer job, but further and further from a CNC machinist, and harder for the CNC machinist to accept. So this doesn't mean that people can't progress in their careers, but it means those paths are going to change. Now, I want to go back to this idea of automation versus augmentation. Again, the press loves to make a big thing about this. It's really important to think about it, not just because the press is talking about it, but because it has significant implication for what people are going to need to know how to do. Now, I told you we did all these kinds of models. We created all sorts of models, and we started working on this. Here was the interesting thing. We started seeing some of the same skills as being highly automated and highly augmented. And we looked at that and we said, okay, well, we screwed up, right? It's got to be one or the other. There's people playing tug of war. You know, when we looked into it, we found that there are, in fact, a lot of skills that are going to be both. People are going to get more efficient, and they're going to get more effective. And when you think about what those are, that means these are the new power skills of 21st century work. The skills that make us more efficient, they're the skills that make us more effective, they're the skills that build our productivity and build the productivity of the workforce. And the good news is we can figure out what they are. And when we figure out what they are, we can make sure that every student acquires them, we can make sure that everybody in our workforce is building them, and that way they are ready for 21st century work. Now, a lot of what you may think of as AI skills and the skills that prepare people to be effective in an AI era are applied skills. And so it'd be easy to forget the core foundations. What we actually find is that foundational skills become more important in an AI era, not less. But I want to put an asterisk on this. Because when I define foundational skills, I'm not just talking about soft skills, as people sometimes call them. What I'm talking about is what are the skills that are transversal to 21st century work that everybody needs. We took a set of jobs that are high-value jobs, and we said, what are the skills they embody? And what we found is that foundational skills not only includes the skills of the blue, which are the ones we tend to think of as foundational, kind of the human skills, if you will, but we found increasingly there's a cross-setting set of digital skills, of coding skills, even business skills. Might challenge some people, some folks on the liberal arts faculty to say, hey, wait a second, business skills are transversal. I want to take the example of project management. You need project management whether you are in IT, whether you're in construction, whether you're a nurse who increasingly has to manage care across different providers. And these are the kinds of examples of capabilities we need to make sure that everyone in the workforce has. To that point, you know, I keep hearing this storyline about how, well, AI does a lot of things for us, so all this thing, hey, we've been driving a lot of people to learn how to code or to do data analytics, and maybe we're not going to need those anymore because AI is going to do it for us. I'm here to tell you that it's not true. Sorry. Here's why. I want you to think about a previous kind of automation, previous example, not something we tend to think of as automation. I want you to think about Microsoft Excel. Microsoft Excel actually automated a lot of the tasks that were being done by accountants doing ledger math. Here's why I'm bringing up Microsoft Excel. Raise your hand if you use Microsoft Excel in your work. Wow, that's a lot of hands. I figured as much. Before Microsoft Excel, a lot of the kind of data analysis that we all do, you wouldn't have been able to do, right? It would have had to be, we either just didn't do it or we had to get help from specialists or the like, right? So what Microsoft Excel did is it didn't make data analytics something that you didn't need to do anymore. What it did is it actually democratized that capability and made it something that we all do. And so you're going to see the same thing going on because coding, because data science are going to be easier, more of us are going to need to do them. We may need fewer coding specialists, but more of us are going to need to know how to code. And so again, this goes back to this idea of what's foundational in 21st century work. So I talked for a while about AI and its impacts, and we talked about how a lot of this plays out in skills. So I want to talk about how we can view skills in a way that is about, that can be applied. How we can view skills as a way of making sure that people can be successful in the workforce. And so first, I want to just share, this is from a report that will be released, that we're working on, will be released, I think either next week or the week after by the New York Times, looking at how people launch into work who aren't going to college. We tracked the careers of millions of people who went straight from high school to work. What we found is that there's certain sets of first jobs that dramatically increase your likelihood of success. They make you 4 times more likely to be in top earning quartiles by the time you're 40. And what we found is a lot of those jobs, what makes them so powerful is they require skills. They are skilled work. And so that, first of all, speaks to how do we make sure our high schools are preparing people for them? How do we make sure that people get the guidance they need to get into them? But what it says is that there's a set of skills that will help you launch. We've also can see that skills determine your prospects. Here's an example of students who are graduating becoming marketing managers. And there's a set of skills that associate with becoming a low-paid marketing manager, and there's a set of skills that associate with being a high-paid marketing manager. And you know what? We know what they are. And so it speaks to how we can teach them. It's not just about how we launch people into the workforce. We have right now an education system that is largely once and done. But we know that people need to keep acquiring skills in order to keep rising in their careers. There's a set of skills that are in the gap between low-paid work and high-paid work. Again, we know what they are. We know that in any given occupation, there's some sets of skills which make you 4 or 5 times more likely to keep moving up. Here's an example on the right of customer service representatives. And there's literally some sets of skills that make a customer service representative dramatically more likely to keep moving in her career. Again, we know what those are. We can empower that kind of mobility. And skills also make degrees more valuable. There's a lot that you'll see, all these kind of top 10 lists about which majors pay the most. But what we found is that even more important than what major someone's in is what skills they acquire. In any given program of study, there are certain sets of skills that make people more valuable. Take the example of somebody who's a liberal arts major who develops strategic planning skills, gets paid 20% more than their classmates who don't have those skills. And in any given role, skills drive value. Here's an example of a machinist on the left, and of a maintenance tech on the left, and a maintenance tech who's working in robotics on the right. There's a lot of overlap. There's specific sets of skills that someone can acquire that enable them to work with new technologies, that enable them to be more sought after, that make them more valuable and productive in your workforce. When you put all of this together, it changes the competitiveness of a region. And so I'm going to talk here for a minute about Boston, but I want you to sort of think about how this translates to the Upstate. This is some work that we did with the Massachusetts High Tech Council, which is trying to think about the software industry in Massachusetts and Boston specifically. This is called How Not to Be Boston. So many of us probably know that there's a lot of tech jobs in Boston. After Silicon Valley, it's one of the biggest sort of tech hubs that's out there. And so if you're in Massachusetts and you just look at those numbers, you say, okay, this all feels pretty good. We've got a great tech hub. But it's not enough just to focus on that calculus of jobs. You've got to think about the skills. In any given field, there are certain sets of skills that are both fast-growing and hard to fill. There are certain sets of skills that really kind of are setting the frontier of an industry. The sense that are growing fast, they're spreading across sectors. And you can say, hey, what are those skills that are proving most valuable? And then you have to ask yourself, not just do we have workers in that field, but do we have workers who are significantly possessed of the kind of skills that are frontier skills that are going to put them ahead in the global economy? On that metric, it turns out Boston, not so much. A lot of the tech jobs in Boston are working in legacy technologies. And so it says they may have those jobs today, but they may not have them in the future if they don't turn that curve. So as we sort of think about the manufacturing workforce here, the healthcare workforce here, the financial services workforce here, some of the key sectors in the Upstate, and say, what does it take to make sure that we are competitive? It's not just about having the right numbers of people, but it's about saying, how do we make sure we've got the concentration of skills that keep us competitive? Skills, ultimately, are a really amazing kind of alchemy. Remember that whole Economics 101 arbitrage thing, buy low, sell high? Skills enable us to buy low and sell high in our careers. And so take the example here of somebody working as a graphic designer, making $51,000 a year. Graphic designer who has interaction design skills makes $67,000 a year. It doesn't cost $16,000 to learn that skill. So this is an example of where we can help people buy low and sell high in themselves. This is an example of how we can buy low and sell high in our own workforces. And so it's those kinds of partnerships between work and education, by bridging those kind of gaps, we can help people to arbitrage their careers. That's critical as we sort of think about how all this plays out in the workforce that we have today. Nationally, there are many, many people who are stranded talent. People wind up being stranded for a whole bunch of reasons, sometimes because they made a bad start and they wind up working in jobs that are low wage, high churn, about 38 million Americans nationwide. Another about 38, I can't read it from here, people who went to college, took some credits, and stopped out along the way and wound up stuck as a result. There's a whole nother people, about 31 million Americans, who got a degree and wound up in a job they didn't need to go to college to get. And there's some of people who are working in college-level jobs without much of a future. We think about that landscape. I'm not sure how it plays out here in the Upstate. And then ask, how do we have a growing region? You can't grow if half your team is sitting on the bench. And so what it says is, how do we create the opportunities to continue to enable people to acquire the skills that advance themselves? I'm just going to very quickly sort of wrap by sharing a few thoughts about how we can make sure we build an effective talent strategy here. I'm talking about three things. First of all, knowing the talent we have and where the gaps are. Second, how we can make sure that our education and training pipeline is aligned. And third, how do we grow the pie? So I'm going to first just say we've got to be able to know the talent we have. That sounds basic, but a lot of the way that we understand talent today is about jobs, not skills. We know how many people are working in some occupation, but we don't necessarily actually have the map of the contours, the map of the skills that define those contours of our workforce. And that's important because the workforce is moving in different directions. Here's an example of data science skills, all of which are sort of growing tech skills. And you can sort of see that there's some sets of skills in that spectrum that are growing faster than others, that are spreading further than others, and we have to understand what are those skills and do we have them? We need to also be able to benchmark effectively. Same kind of thing I was sharing about Boston, you can do here and say, okay, in our key sectors, what are the skills that are strongest, or rather in each role by role in those sectors? How possessed are people here in the Upstate of the kind of skills that define the future? And how does that benchmark against the kinds of cities and regions that we're competing with? What it also says, though, is that we've got to think about where is that talent today that could come along. Again, if we sort of think about this idea that we can't win if half our team's sitting on the bench, we're going to think about this. I'm going to tell you a story about Orlando. So Orlando's been having, like South Carolina, it's been having a lot of tailwinds of people moving into the state. A lot of economic growth going on that's drawing people in. So they're pulling talent in, but they're not pulling talent up. When you look at the list of the top cities in America based on economic mobility that people are experiencing, top 100 cities, Orlando ranks 92. So what they wanted to look at is the question of how do we create that pull-up engine for Orlando? And the way you start doing that is not by saying who's stranded, but ironically by saying where is talent needed. And so they said, okay, where is that talent, sector by sector? What are those jobs? What are the jobs at the four-way intersection of employers can't get enough of them, they're critical to growth sectors, and yes, they're also key to giving good mobility for workers, and they represent avenues for new equity into the workforce. And then say, what are those jobs? Because those jobs now matter to everyone. They're not just solving a social problem, they're solving a business problem, they're solving a growth problem, they're solving an economic mobility problem. What are those jobs? And now work backwards and say, where's the talent that's got some of the right sets of skills? How do we develop the training that will bridge those gaps? It also means that takes me to this idea of how do we make sure things are aligned. We've got to make sure that our curricula are teaching the skills that matter. When I say the skills that matter, I mean really actually being careful that we're not missing gaps. This is an example, again, of graphic designers. It's not hard to say, hey, graphic designers need graphic design skills, the Adobe suite, that kind of stuff. But there's a bunch of things that are critical for them being ready, which sometimes aren't graphic design skills that we forget to train. Graphic designers do project-based work. We don't tend to teach them project management skills. We don't tend to teach them budgeting skills, which is important in running a project. At the same time, there's new emerging specialties like being able to design an infographic. We have to make sure we can track that. We need to go back to the idea of the core foundational skills and how we make sure that we're building them so people have resilience in their careers. And we have to make sure that we've got credentials that business understands. Did some work recently together with Excel and Ed looking at CTE credentials. This is the idea of making sure that high schoolers and college students can acquire credentials that are industry recognized, that should allow them to make better transitions into work. You know what we found? First of all, half of states didn't even track any data on what credentials students were earning. Of those that did, only 19% of credentials are actually in demand for jobs that are high quality, growing jobs, right? So that means 80% of those credential students were earning weren't positioning them for good jobs. So in order to be aligned, we have to make sure that not only are we teaching the right things, but we're credentialing students in a way that demonstrates good, proven outcomes. And the good news is we can measure that today. We also need to make sure that it's not just that students go through school and then they wind up in the workplace, but they are developing work experience all the way through. There is so much data out there today which says that at all levels, K-12 and certainly university, that work-based learning is critical for good outcomes. It's the single biggest thing you can do to reduce the risk of students graduating into jobs they don't need to go to college to get. It's helpful to all students. It's specifically helpful and even more helpful to students coming from underrepresented backgrounds. How do we make sure that that becomes a key part of all of our programs, that every student has a meaningful work-based learning experience? Finally, I want to talk about how we can assure that we have a means of growing the pie. There's a lot of times we get into a mindset where we're just trying to mine the same old talent pools. And we forget that some of the talent that we need is right there under our nose. Here's an example of a network engineer, and it turns out a lot of skills in common with a business analyst. And a lot of organizations that are struggling to get network engineers have business analysts. And we know what are the skills that are in the gap. We can train that. We can create programs that we can enable people to come back to school and bridge that gap. And we can take that same approach and think about how it bears out regionally. Here's an example from Cleveland, where in their economic development planning, they realized they were going to need a whole lot more industrial production managers. They had about 2,500 in the city at the time. They expected to need over the next 10 years, I think it was about 9,000 more. Right? That's not saying you can do organically, go from 2,500 to 9,000 more. And so what it forced them to do was to say, where could they come from? So you can see a whole set of other jobs where they could see, here's people who have some of those skills today. How do we bring them along? By the way, when they could do that, it wasn't just that they were bringing new talent in, but they were bringing in new representation into a talent pool that hadn't always had a lot of representation. Talent isn't a zero-sum game. We can grow the pie. And so I want to close by carrying that thought forward, by talking about productivity. You're probably furrowing your brow and saying, wait, we're going to have this inspirational close talking about productivity. Here's why you probably shudder when people talk about productivity. When you think about productivity, you're probably thinking about people in white lab coats and stopwatches and clipboards. Productivity is a ratio. I'm going to get all full-on math geek on you here. It's a ratio of the value of people's output to the cost of their input. How much are we getting out of talent versus how much are we paying people? All of our previous work on productivity has been focused on the denominator and how much people cost. How do we use less work? How do we automate people away? How do we use lower cost labor? The real question for us now is, how do we make people's work worth more? And what it takes to make human endeavor more valuable is making sure people have the right skills to rise. Thank you so much.